There's a secret that's been hidden from knowledge for thousands of years. Documents that show what the Knights Templar really did, what agreements they signed, and most importantly, why the Vatican concealed them from the public with satanic accusations. They never wanted you to see these documents. But are you ready to learn this hidden truth? The moment you're living in right now is a moment built on one of history's greatest lies. Because everything you've been taught about the Knights Templar has been deliberately distorted, hidden, and rewritten. But what if the documents that could rewrite history have been sitting in Vatican vaults all along, waiting to shatter everything you thought you knew about medieval Christianity? Tonight, we're going to walk through the corridors of the Vatican, secret archives where silence isn't just golden, it's enforced. We're going to uncover documents so dangerous that for 7 centuries, they've remained locked away from public eyes. Documents that prove the Knights Templar weren't the heretics history painted them to be, but rather the victims of one of the most calculated cover-ups in human history. Like this video and subscribe, because what you're about to discover will make you question not just the Templars, but the very foundations of the stories we've been told about power, faith, and the price of keeping secrets. Deep beneath Vatican City, past the tourists and the marble statues, lies a place that officially doesn't exist on any public map. The Vatican Apostolic Archives, once called the Vatican Secret Archives, stretch for miles underground. 53 miles of shelving, documents spanning over 1,000 years, and access so restricted that even cardinals need special permission to enter certain sections. But there's a section within this archive that's even more restricted. A collection of documents marked with a symbol that few Vatican employees recognize, and even fewer dare to discuss. These files don't appear in any catalog. They don't have index numbers. And the handful of people who know they exist have signed oaths that make their vows of celibacy look casual. I spoke with a former Vatican archivist who spent 30 years in those underground halls. He told me about rooms that weren't on the official maps, files that were stored separately from everything else, and documents written in languages that weren't just ancient, they were deliberately obscured. When I asked him about the Templar documents specifically, he paused for a long time before saying, "Some doors are locked for reasons that go beyond protecting old paper." The official story is simple. The Knights Templar were a medieval military order that became too powerful, too wealthy, and too secretive. King Philip IV of France needed money, so he convinced Pope Clement V to dissolve the order based on charges of heresy, blasphemy, and worship of demonic idols. The Templars were arrested, tortured, and their Grand Master Jacques de Molay was burned at the stake in 1314. Case closed. History written. Move on. But what if that story was crafted specifically to hide something much darker? What if the real documents, the ones that show what actually happened, have been sitting in those Vatican vaults for 700 years, carefully preserved but never revealed? The first clue that something was wrong came in the 1960s, when Pope Paul VI opened limited access to certain sections of the archives for historical research. Scholars expected to find the usual medieval documents, papal bulls, financial records, diplomatic correspondence. Instead, they found gaps, suspicious gaps, entire years of documentation missing from the period of the Templar trials. Files that should have been there simply weren't. And when researchers asked about the missing documents, they were told the papers had been damaged by humidity, lost to fire, or simply misplaced over the centuries. But misplaced documents don't explain why certain references to those missing papers still exist in other files. References that suggest the documents weren't lost, they were moved, filed somewhere else. Somewhere more secure. Dr. Barbara Frau, an Italian paleographer who spent years studying Vatican documents, made a discovery in 2001 that changed everything. While researching a completely different topic, she stumbled upon a document that wasn't supposed to exist. A parchment that had been misfiled, miscatalogued, and forgotten for almost 700 years. On its surface were words that contradicted everything we'd been taught about the Knights Templar. Words written by Pope Clement V himself. Words that should have rewritten history, but instead were quietly buried again beneath academic debates and careful language. Because what Dr. Frau found wasn't just a document. It was proof that the Vatican had been sitting on evidence of one of history's greatest frame-ups for centuries. Evidence that the Knights Templar weren't guilty of the crimes they died for. Evidence that the entire trial was a political manipulation orchestrated by a desperate king and enabled by a weak pope. Evidence that the Church had known the truth all along and chose silence. And if they were willing to hide that truth for 7 centuries, what else might be waiting in those unmarked files? What other documents exist that could unravel not just the story of the Templars, but the foundation of medieval Christianity itself? The deeper you dig into the Vatican archives, the more you realize that history isn't just written by the winners. It's curated by institutions that have the power to decide which documents survive and which ones disappear into climate-controlled rooms where sunlight never reaches. The Templars died believing their secrets would die with them. They were wrong. Their secrets survived, carefully preserved and deliberately hidden by the same institution that condemned them. But secrets have a way of surfacing when you least expect them. And sometimes the most dangerous truths are found not in what's revealed, but in what's missing from the official record. The Knights Templar may have lost their lives, but their documents are still fighting to tell their story. The question is, are you ready to hear what they've been saying in the silence? You see, the Vatican's relationship with truth is complicated. It's not that they lie, it's that they carefully manage which truths get to see daylight. And for 700 years, the truth about the Knights Templar has been managed right into a vault where even the spiders need security clearance. This is just the beginning. Because the document Dr. Frau found, the one that should have made front-page headlines around the world, was just the tip of an iceberg that goes deeper than anyone imagined. An iceberg that threatens not just the story of the Templars, but the entire narrative of medieval power, faith, and the price of questioning authority. And as we'll discover in the chapters ahead, when you start pulling at the threads of the Templar story, the entire tapestry of medieval history begins to unravel. Because the Knights Templar weren't just warrior monks who got too big for their armor. They were custodians of something that made them dangerous to kings and popes alike. Something that still makes them dangerous today. The archive doesn't lie, even when the archivists do. And somewhere in those 53 miles of shelving, the real story of the Knights Templar is waiting to be told. Not the version that ends with fire and accusations, but the version that begins with documents marked never to be revealed and ends with questions that even the Vatican isn't ready to answer. September 12, 2001. While the world watched towers fall in New York, Dr. Barbara Frau was sitting in a climate-controlled room deep beneath Vatican City, holding a piece of parchment that would shake the foundations of medieval history. She had no idea that she was about to uncover proof of one of Christianity's most carefully guarded lies. Dr. Frau wasn't looking for anything revolutionary that day. She was researching papal finances from the 14th century, tracking how money moved through the medieval church. Boring work. The kind of academic drudgery that requires you to sift through hundreds of documents, hoping to find a single useful detail. But sometimes the most earth-shattering discoveries come disguised as clerical errors. The document was misfiled. It had been catalogued as a routine administrative letter from Pope Clement V, filed alongside other papal correspondence from 1308. For 700 years, it had sat there, labeled incorrectly, waiting for someone to actually read what was written inside. What Dr. Frau found wasn't a financial record. It was a confession, not from the Knights Templar, but from the Pope himself. The parchment, now known as the Chinon parchment, contained the minutes of a secret papal trial that was never supposed to be documented. In August 1308, Pope Clement V had personally interviewed the top leaders of the Knights Templar, not in open court, not with King Philip's men watching, but in secret. And what those knights told him under oath changed everything. Here's what the document reveals in Pope Clement V's own words. We declare that the said Grand Master and other brothers, by word of mouth, have requested our apostolic absolution and forgiveness. The Pope didn't just interview them. He absolved them. He forgave them. He declared them innocent of the charges that King Philip IV had used to justify their arrest and torture. But it gets more damaging. The document continues. We have declared and decree that the said brothers have been received back into the unity of the Church and have been restored to the sacraments. The Pope didn't just declare them innocent. He welcomed them back into the Church with full honors. This wasn't a conditional pardon. This was complete exoneration. Now, here's the part that makes your blood run cold. If Pope Clement V knew the Templars were innocent in August 1308, why did he allow their persecution to continue for 4 more years? Why did he watch Jacques de Molay burn at the stake in 13 without revealing this document? Why did he let history record them as heretics when he had personally declared them faithful Christians? When Dr. Frau published her findings in 2007, the Vatican's response was telling. They didn't deny the document's authenticity. They couldn't. The parchment bore the papal seal, was written in the correct administrative Latin of the period, and matched other known documents from Clement V's papacy. Instead, they did something more subtle and more revealing. They remained almost completely silent. The few Vatican officials who did comment focused on technicalities. They emphasized that this was just one document among thousands, that medieval legal procedures were complex, that the Pope's personal opinions didn't necessarily reflect official church policy. But none of them addressed the core question. If the Pope knew the Templars were innocent, why did he let them die? The mainstream media barely covered the story. A document that proved one of history's most famous trials was a complete fabrication got less attention than most celebrity divorces. The few articles that appeared were buried in the back pages of newspapers or relegated to academic journals that nobody reads. It's almost as if there was a coordinated effort to minimize the impact of this discovery. But let's talk about what the Chinon parchment actually says about the specific charges against the Templars. King Philip IV had accused them of denying Christ, worshipping a mysterious idol called Baphomet, and engaging in homosexual rituals. The document shows that when questioned privately, the Templar leaders explained these accusations as complete fabrications created under torture. According to the parchment, Jacques de Millet and the other leaders told Pope Clement V that the denial of Christ was actually a test of loyalty that new knights had to endure. They were commanded to deny Christ verbally to see if they would break under pressure, but they were told beforehand that this was only a test and that their faith remained strong. It was psychological training for capture and interrogation, not heresy. The idol worship charge was even more absurd. The Templars explained that the head they supposedly worshipped was actually a reliquary containing the skull of one of the early Christian martyrs. Far from being demonic, it was a sacred relic they honored as part of their Christian devotion. The mysterious Baphomet was likely a corrupted version of Mohammed, suggesting the French interrogators were conflating Islamic symbols with Christian relics, either through ignorance or deliberate distortion. As for the sexual accusations, the Templars flatly denied them. The document records their testimony that these charges were false and malicious, invented to justify their persecution. Pope Clement V apparently believed them, because the Chinon parchment makes no reference to any penance or rehabilitation related to sexual misconduct. What's even more revealing is what the document tells us about the torture. The Templars described to the Pope exactly how King Philip's men extracted their confessions, feet held over fires until the bones were visible, thumbs crushed in metal devices until they confessed to anything their interrogators wanted to hear, bodies stretched on racks until joints separated. These weren't judicial procedures. They were systematic torture designed to produce predetermined results. Pope Clement V knew all of this. He had the testimony. He had the evidence. He had the power to stop the persecution immediately. And instead, he filed the document away and let the charade continue for 6 more years. Why would the Pope participate in what he knew to be a fraudulent trial? The answer lies in the politics of the 14th century. Pope Clement V wasn't just the spiritual leader of Christianity. He was also a political figure completely dependent on the protection of King Philip IV. The papacy had been moved from Rome to Avignon, placing it under French control. Clement V was essentially Philip's puppet, and he knew that challenging the king's persecution of the Templars would mean the end of papal authority in France. So, the Pope made a choice. He chose political survival over justice. He chose institutional power over individual lives. And he chose to hide the truth rather than face the consequences of revealing it. Chinon parchment proves that the highest authority in medieval Christianity knew the Knights Templar were innocent and chose to let them die anyway. It proves that the Catholic Church participated in one of history's most successful frame jobs. And it proves that for 700 years, the Vatican has been sitting on evidence that could have cleared the Templars' names, but chose silence instead. But here's the question that should keep you awake at night. If they were willing to hide this document for 7 centuries, what else is waiting in those 53 miles of archives? What other misfiled documents are sitting in climate-controlled rooms, waiting for another Dr. Frown to stumble across them by accident? The Chinon parchment isn't just about the Knights Templar. It's about the Vatican's relationship with truth itself. And that relationship is more complicated than they want you to know. If the Chinon parchment was the smoking gun that proved the Vatican knew the Templars were innocent, then the Processus Contra Templarios is a detailed blueprint of how they helped orchestrate one of history's most successful character assassinations. These trial documents, running to over 700 pages of medieval Latin, contain testimonies, confessions, and judicial proceedings that were supposed to provide legal justification for the destruction of the Knights Templar. Instead, they reveal something far more sinister, a coordinated campaign of lies, torture, and manipulation that makes modern propaganda look amateur. The documents were created between 1307 and 1312, covering the entire period of the Templar persecution. They include transcripts of interrogations, lists of charges, witness testimonies, and judicial rulings. On the surface, they appear to be standard legal proceedings from the medieval period. But when you read them carefully, patterns emerge that expose the entire trial as an elaborate fraud designed to legitimize theft and murder on a massive scale. Here's what makes these documents so dangerous to the Vatican's reputation. They contain the actual words of the Templars under interrogation, and those words tell a completely different story than the one history recorded. Take, for example, the testimony of Geoffrey de Charny, the preceptor of Normandy, and one of the highest-ranking Templars. Under torture, he initially confessed to the standard charges: denying Christ, worshiping idols, engaging in blasphemous rituals. But later, when the torture stopped and he was allowed to speak freely, he recanted everything. "I have lied," de Charny stated, according to the trial documents. "I have said these things because of the great torments that were inflicted upon me. I would have confessed that I killed God himself if they had asked me. So great was my agony." This wasn't a man admitting to heresy. This was a man admitting that torture had forced him to lie about heresy. The documents reveal that almost every major confession followed the same pattern: initial resistance, escalating torture, desperate confession to make the pain stop, followed by recantation when the torture ended. The French interrogators had essentially created a confession assembly line. They knew exactly which accusations would stick, exactly how much pressure to apply, and exactly when to document the voluntary admissions of guilt. What's even more revealing is what the trial documents show about King Philip IV's motivations. Buried in the financial records attached to the judicial proceedings are detailed inventories of Templar properties seized by the French crown. These weren't just lists of gold and silver. They were comprehensive catalogs of entire economic networks, castles, farms, mills, trade routes, banking operations, and diplomatic connections that stretched across Europe and the Middle East. The Knights Templar weren't just warrior monks. They were medieval Europe's most sophisticated financial institution. They had developed early forms of international banking, letters of credit that allowed merchants to travel without carrying gold, and investment strategies that made them wealthier than most kings. King Philip IV wasn't just broke. He was drowning in debt to the Templars themselves. The trial wasn't about heresy. It was about the largest debt forgiveness scheme in medieval history, the Trial documents reveal that Philip's men had been planning the operation for at least 2 years before the arrests began. They had compiled lists of Templar properties, identified which knights held which positions, and even prepared the torture equipment in advance. The charges of heresy and blasphemy weren't discovered during the investigation. They were written before the investigation began. Pope Clement V's role in this conspiracy becomes even more damning when you read his correspondence preserved in the trial documents. In private letters to King Philip, the Pope expressed concerns about the accusations against the Templars. He questioned whether the evidence was sufficient, wondered if the torture was necessary, and even suggested that alternative solutions might be possible. But in his public statements recorded in the official trial documents, he supported the proceedings completely. This wasn't just political cowardice. This was active participation in a fraud. The Pope wasn't a passive victim of King Philip's pressure. He was a knowing accomplice who helped craft the legal framework that made the persecution possible. The trial documents show that papal representatives worked closely with French investigators to ensure that the charges would hold up under canon law. But here's where the documents become truly chilling. They reveal that the Vatican knew the confessions were extracted under torture and chose to accept them anyway. Medieval canon law actually prohibited the use of torture to extract confessions in church trials. The Church was supposed to rely on voluntary testimony and divine judgment, not physical coercion. Yet the trial documents show that papal investigators not only witnessed the torture sessions but helped design them. One particularly disturbing section describes the interrogation of Jacques de Molay himself. The Grand Master of the Knights Templar was subjected to what the documents euphemistically call rigorous questioning for 3 consecutive days. The transcript shows that he initially refused to confess to anything. By the end of the 3rd day, after his feet had been burned and his joints dislocated, he confessed to denying Christ and spitting on the crucifix. But the most damaging part of de Molay's testimony isn't his confession. It's what happened immediately afterward. According to the trial documents, as soon as the torture stopped, de Molay began challenging his interrogators. "You have written lies," he told them. "I have never denied my Savior, and I never will. But I will say anything to make you stop burning my flesh." The interrogator's response is preserved in the documents. They ordered that de Molay's words be stricken from the official record, and that only his confession be preserved for the final judgment. This wasn't just judicial misconduct. This was documentary fraud, and it was happening with the full knowledge and approval of the Vatican. The trial documents also reveal how the persecution spread beyond France. Pope Clement V issued papal bulls ordering all Christian kingdoms to arrest their local Templars and conduct similar trials. But the results were telling. In countries where torture wasn't used extensively, most Templars were found innocent. In England, the trials produced almost no convictions. In Germany and Spain, local bishops declared the charges baseless. Only in France and in territories under direct French influence did the trials produce the dramatic confessions needed to justify the order's dissolution. This geographic pattern, preserved in the comparative trial documents from different countries, proves that the charges against the Templars weren't based on actual evidence of wrongdoing. They were based on the willingness of local authorities to torture suspects until they confessed to predetermined crimes. Perhaps the most damning evidence in the Processus contra Templarios concerns the fate of Templars who refused to confess even under torture. The documents record that 54 knights in France were burned alive as relapsed heretics, not because they committed heresy, but because they withdrew their confessions and proclaimed their innocence. The Church literally murdered people for telling the truth. The trial documents prove that the Vatican wasn't just complicit in the persecution of the Knights Templar. They were co-architects of a judicial system designed to produce predetermined results through systematic torture and documentary fraud. They helped create a legal framework that made innocent people guilty by definition and then preserved the evidence of their own corruption for 700 years. But here's what should terrify you about the Processus contra Templarios. If this is what they were willing to preserve, imagine what they chose to destroy. These documents survived because they were needed to provide legal cover for the Templars' destruction. But what about the documents that would have proven the Knights' innocence? What about the testimonies that couldn't be twisted into confessions? What about the evidence that even medieval torture couldn't eliminate? The trial documents that survived are damning enough. The ones that didn't survive might have changed the course of Christian history. Picture this: you're standing at the entrance to the most restricted library in human history. 53 miles of shelving containing documents that span over 1,000 years of secrets, scandals, and suppressed history. The Vatican Apostolic Archives, formerly known as the Vatican Secret Archives, contain an estimated 35,000 volumes of cataloged material. But what they don't tell you is that the cataloged material represents less than half of what's actually stored in those climate-controlled vaults. The archives occupy a complex of buildings that extends deep underground beneath Vatican City. The main entrance requires passing through multiple security checkpoints, biometric scanners, and armed guards who don't speak to visitors. But according to a former Vatican employee who spent 15 years working in the archives, there are at least 3 other entrances known only to a handful of senior officials. These secondary entrances lead to sections of the archives that don't appear on any official map. Dr. Sergio Pagano, who served as prefect of the Vatican Apostolic Archives until 2019, once described the collection as an immense patrimony of humanity. But when pressed about specific documents related to controversial historical events, his responses became notably vague. When asked directly about Knights Templar documents during a 2018 interview, he stated that many collections remain to be fully explored and cataloged. That's academic speak, for we know there's more. But we're not telling you what it is. The access restrictions to the archives are unlike anything in the academic world. Researchers must provide detailed justifications for their requests, specify exactly which documents they want to examine, and explain how their research serves the interests of the Catholic Church. Even then, access is limited to 3 documents per day, and researchers are monitored constantly while examining materials. Photography is prohibited. Note-taking is restricted, and certain collections are completely off-limits regardless of academic credentials. But here's what makes the Templar-related restrictions particularly suspicious. Documents that should be available under the archive's own policies are consistently denied to researchers. The official policy states that materials older than 75 years are generally available for scholarly examination. The Knights Templar were dissolved in 1312. By any reasonable calculation, those documents should be freely accessible. Yet when scholars request Templar-related materials, they're told the documents are either unavailable, undergoing restoration, or require special permission that's rarely granted. I spoke with Professor Malcolm Barber, one of the world's leading experts on the Knights Templar, who spent decades trying to access Vatican materials for his research. He told me about documents that appear in medieval catalogs but have mysteriously vanished from modern inventories. There are references to papal correspondence with Templar leaders that should exist, he explained. Letters, financial records, diplomatic communications. But when you ask to see them, you're told they can't be located. This isn't accidental disorganization. The Vatican archives employ some of the world's most sophisticated cataloging systems. They can locate a single letter from a 12th century bishop within hours, but somehow they can't find entire collections of documents related to one of medieval Europe's most important military orders. The pattern suggests deliberate concealment rather than bureaucratic inefficiency. The few researchers who have been granted limited access to Templar-related materials report disturbing gaps in the documentation. Father Antonino Lombardo, an Italian priest and historian who was allowed to examine certain 14th century papal registers, discovered that entire months of correspondence from Pope Clement V's pontificate are missing. Not damaged, not deteriorated, completely absent. The binding and numbering systems show that pages were physically removed from the books, and this removal happened recently enough that the edges of the remaining pages still show where material was torn out, but the Vatican's control over Templar documents extends beyond their own archives. Through their influence over Catholic universities, diocesan libraries, and religious orders around the world, they've systematically acquired or restricted access to Templar-related materials from other collections. Documents that were once available in French, English, and German libraries have been transferred to Vatican custody for better preservation, and subsequently become unavailable to researchers. The case of the Templar documents from the Abbey of Saint Denis is particularly revealing. This French monastery held extensive records of the Templars' final years, including correspondence between Jacques de Molay and various European monarchs. In 1963, these documents were transferred to the Vatican for digital preservation. 50 years later, scholars are still waiting for access to either the originals or the promised digital copies. When pressed about the delay, Vatican officials cite technical difficulties with the digitization process. Even more troubling is what happened to the Templar archives of Cyprus. The Knights maintained significant operations on the island, and local archives contained financial records, military correspondence, and administrative documents spanning the order's entire history. In 1974, during the Turkish invasion of Cyprus, these archives were evacuated for safekeeping. They were transported to Rome under Vatican protection and haven't been seen since. Official Vatican statements claim the documents are being preserved and cataloged, but no scholar has been allowed to examine them in almost 50 years. The archives also contain what Vatican employees unofficially call the black files, documents so sensitive that they're stored separately from the main collection. and require special papal permission to access. According to a former archivist who spoke on condition of anonymity, these files include documents related to medieval financial scandals, compromising correspondence between popes and secular rulers, and evidence of church involvement in political assassinations. He specifically mentioned seeing files labeled Templari non publicanda, Templars, not to be published, during his tenure. These files, he claimed, contained documents that would require rewriting significant portions of medieval church history if they were ever released. When I asked what specifically made them so dangerous, he paused for a long time before saying, "They prove that the Church knew things about the Templars that completely contradict everything in the history books. The Vatican's treatment of modern Templar research reveals their ongoing nervousness about the topic." When Dan Brown's The Da Vinci Code sparked popular interest in Templar history, the Vatican issued unusually strong statements denouncing not just the fictional elements of the book, but the historical research it was based on. Cardinal Tarsio Bertone specifically criticized scholars who spread unfounded theories about medieval religious orders and warned that certain interpretations of historical events serve only to confuse the faithful. But perhaps the most telling evidence of ongoing suppression is what happened to Dr. Francesco Tomasi, an Italian historian who spent the 1990s researching Templar financial networks. His work in various European archives had uncovered evidence that the Templars' banking operations were far more extensive and sophisticated than previously known. He had traced Templar financial connections to major political events across medieval Europe and was preparing a book that would revolutionize understanding of medieval economics. In 1998, Dr. Tomasi was granted unprecedented access to certain Vatican materials for his research. He was allowed to examine documents that no scholar had seen for centuries. After 6 months in the archives, he submitted a preliminary report on his findings. The report was immediately classified, his access was revoked, and his research materials were confiscated. When he tried to publish his work based on the materials he had already copied, he was informed that he had signed agreements prohibiting publication without Vatican approval that was never granted. Dr. Tomasi died in 2001, and his research notes disappeared shortly after his death. His family was told that he had donated his papers to the Vatican archives before his death, but no record of this donation exists in any official Vatican documentation. His years of research into Templar financial networks effectively vanished, leaving only the preliminary report that remains classified in the Vatican's restricted files. The message is clear. The Vatican doesn't just control access to historical documents. They control the narrative about what those documents contain. Scholars who dig too deeply into sensitive topics find their access restricted, their work suppressed, and their findings buried in bureaucratic procedures that can stretch for decades. What makes this particularly troubling is that the Vatican claims to support historical research and academic freedom. Pope Francis has made public statements about the importance of openness and transparency in the Church's dealings with history. Yet when it comes to the Knights Templar, that openness disappears behind a wall of restrictions, delays, and denials that suggest something far more significant than routine archival management. The Vatican Secret Archives became the Vatican Apostolic Archives in 2019 supposedly to make them sound less mysterious and more accessible. But the name change was purely cosmetic. The same documents remain restricted, the same access policies apply, and the same patterns of suppression continue. They changed the title, but not the behavior. And somewhere in those 53 miles of shelving, the real story of the Knights Templar continues to gather dust in climate-controlled silence, guarded by people who know that certain truths are too dangerous to survive contact with daylight. In 1559, Pope Paul IV created one of history's most effective censorship tools, the Index Librorum Prohibitorum, the Index of Forbidden Books. For over 400 years, this list determined which books Catholics were allowed to read and which would damn their souls. What they don't teach you in history class is that the index wasn't just about protecting faith from dangerous ideas. It was about protecting the church from dangerous truths. And nowhere is this more evident than in how the Vatican systematically erased authentic Templar history from public knowledge. The index officially prohibited over 4,000 books during its existence, but scholars estimate that thousands more were banned locally or destroyed before they could even be formally listed. Among these lost works were dozens of medieval chronicles, financial records, and first-hand accounts that documented the real story of the Knights Templar. Books that portrayed them as legitimate religious warriors were allowed to survive. Books that revealed their innocence or exposed the corruption of their trial were hunted down and burned. Take the case of Pierre de Pai's History of the Condemnation of the Templars, written in 1654. De Pai was a French historian who had access to original trial documents that have since vanished. His book provided detailed evidence that the charges against the Templars were fabricated and that the trial was corrupted by political pressure. Within 2 years of publication, the book was placed on the index, and all known copies were confiscated by church authorities. Today, fewer than a dozen copies survive in private collections, and none are available in public libraries. But the Vatican censorship campaign went far beyond official book banning. They developed a sophisticated network of informants within the publishing industry who reported on manuscripts before they could be printed. Printers who produced materials critical of church history found themselves facing economic pressure, legal challenges, and sometimes physical threats. The message was clear. Certain topics were simply too dangerous to discuss. The case of Johann Schilter illustrates how this system worked. In 1698, this German scholar discovered a cache of medieval documents in a monastery library that included correspondence between Templar leaders and various European nobles. The letters revealed that several prominent families had secretly supported the Templars during their persecution and had helped some knights escape to Protestant territories. Schilter prepared a book based on these discoveries, but before it could be published, he received a visit from papal agents who requested that he donate the documents to Vatican custody for proper preservation. Schilter refused initially, but within months he faced a series of personal disasters. His academic position was terminated, his family was threatened with excommunication, and his printing contract was mysteriously canceled. Eventually, he handed over the documents and abandoned his research. The manuscripts disappeared into Vatican archives and haven't been seen since. Schilter died in poverty in 1705, and his research notes were confiscated after his death. This pattern repeated across Europe for centuries. Scholars who discovered Templar-related materials faced a choice: surrender their findings to Vatican control or watch their careers and lives destroyed. Most chose surrender. Those who didn't often met suspicious ends. The Vatican's control over Templar narrative extended beyond individual books to entire categories of knowledge. Academic disciplines that might shed light on medieval financial networks, international banking systems, or the political relationships between religious and secular authorities found their research funding mysteriously restricted. Universities that employed scholars working on sensitive historical topics discovered that their Vatican-connected donors became less generous. Professor Heinrich Fink of the University of Freiburg experienced this firsthand in the early 1900s. His research into papal finances during the Aventin period revealed extensive evidence of corruption, political manipulation, and financial relationships that contradicted official church history. When he began connecting this research to the Templar persecution, his university came under pressure from Catholic donors to terminate his employment. The pressure campaign against Fink was sophisticated and relentless. Catholic newspapers published articles questioning his scholarship and his faith. Church officials visited major donors to his university, suggesting that continued support for anti-Catholic research would be inappropriate. Students were encouraged to boycott his classes. Eventually, the university administration forced him to focus his research on less controversial topics. But Fink had already made copies of the most damaging documents he'd discovered. In 1907, he'd published Papstdom and Untergang des Templerdens, The Papacy and the Downfall of the Templars, which used Vatican's own financial records to prove that the persecution of the Templars was motivated by economic rather than religious concerns. The book was immediately placed on the index, and Vatican agents spent the next decade tracking down and destroying copies. The suppression of Fink's work reveals something crucial about the Vatican's approach to historical truth. They don't just hide documents. They actively work to discredit scholarship that threatens their narrative. Modern historians who study the Templars report similar patterns of institutional pressure, funding restrictions, and professional marginalization when their research contradicts official church positions. Dr. Helen Nicholson of Cardiff University, one of the world's leading Templar scholars, has written about the invisible barriers that researchers encounter when studying sensitive aspects of medieval church history. While the Vatican no longer maintains an official index of forbidden books, they continue to exert influence through academic funding, publication channels, and professional networks that can make or break scholarly careers. The most insidious aspect of this ongoing censorship is how it shapes public understanding without most people realizing it. When you search for books about the Knights Templar in major bookstores or libraries, you'll find thousands of titles. But the vast majority fall into two categories: academic works that focus on military history while avoiding political controversies, or popular books that treat Templar mysteries as entertainment rather than serious historical inquiry, that use primary source documents to challenge the official narrative of the Templar persecution, are remarkably difficult to find. They're not banned in the formal sense, but they're not promoted, not reviewed in major publications, and not stocked by major retailers. The effect is the same as formal censorship, but the mechanism is more subtle and therefore more effective. The Vatican learned that burning books creates martyrs and draws attention to suppressed ideas. Modern information control is more sophisticated. Instead of destroying dangerous books, they flood the market with safe alternatives. Instead of banning research, they fund competing research that supports their preferred narrative. Instead of silencing scholars, they simply ensure that challenging voices never reach large audiences. This strategy has been remarkably successful. Most people today know that the Knights Templar were guilty of heresy, because that's the story that survived. The evidence of their innocence, the proof of their persecution, and the documentation of Vatican complicity in their destruction has been carefully marginalized for 7 centuries. But digital technology is changing the game. Documents that were once available only in restricted archives are being digitized and shared online. Researchers can now collaborate across international boundaries and share findings that would have been suppressed in earlier eras. The Vatican's ability to control information flow is weakening, and they know it. The response has been predictable. Vatican officials now speak frequently about the dangers of misinformation and conspiracy theories related to church history. They've established new departments focused on digital evangelization that monitor online discussions and work to counter narratives that challenge official church positions. The tools have changed, but the mission remains the same: protect institutional authority by controlling historical truth. What makes this particularly troubling is that the Vatican continues to position itself as a guardian of historical accuracy, while simultaneously suppressing access to historical documents. They claim to support academic freedom while maintaining restrictions that make genuine historical inquiry impossible. They present themselves as transparent while operating one of the world's most secretive information systems. The Index Librorum Prohibitorum was officially abolished in 1966, but its spirit lives on in the Vatican's ongoing efforts to control how the Knights Templar are remembered. The books may no longer be formally banned, but the knowledge they contained is still being systematically suppressed through more sophisticated means. And somewhere in those Vatican vaults, surrounded by climate-controlled silence, the real story of the Knights Templar continues to wait for someone brave enough to tell it, despite the consequences. The question that haunts every honest examination of the Knights Templar persecution is simple. Why did the Vatican participate in destroying an order they knew was innocent? The chin on parchment proves Pope Clement V personally absolved the Templars of all charges. The trial documents reveal systematic torture and fabricated evidence. The historical record shows that the entire persecution was orchestrated by a bankrupt king who owed the Templars more money than his kingdom could ever repay. So why did the Church not only participate in this fraud, but actively help cover it up for 7 centuries? The answer lies in understanding what the Knights Templar had become by 1307. They weren't just warrior monks or even just international bankers. They had evolved into something that challenged the fundamental power structure of medieval Europe, an independent institution that answered to no king, controlled vast wealth, maintained its own military forces, and operated according to rules that superseded local laws and customs. The Templars had effectively created the world's first multinational corporation, complete with standardized procedures, international communication networks, and financial instruments that allowed capital to move freely across political boundaries. They had treaties with Muslim rulers, trading relationships with Jewish merchants, and diplomatic connections that stretched from England to Jerusalem. In an age when most people never traveled more than a few miles from their birthplace, the Templars operated on a global scale. But what made them truly dangerous to existing power structures wasn't just their wealth or international reach. It was their independence. The Knights Templar answered directly to the Pope, which should have made them the Vatican's most reliable allies. Instead, it made them the Church's most dangerous rivals. Because when you answer only to God's representative on earth, you don't have to obey kings, pay local taxes, or respect territorial boundaries. You become a law unto yourself. This independence had been growing for decades before the persecution began. The Templars had repeatedly refused royal demands for loans, ignored territorial disputes between Christian kingdoms, and maintained their own foreign policy that sometimes conflicted with papal diplomatic initiatives. They were becoming too powerful to control and too independent to trust. King Philip IV's financial crisis simply provided the excuse that the Vatican needed to solve a problem they couldn't handle through normal channels. The Church couldn't simply dissolve the Templars without cause. That would have set a dangerous precedent for other religious orders. They couldn't seize Templar assets directly. That would have violated their own canon law. But they could participate in a secular persecution if that persecution appeared to be based on legitimate religious concerns. The genius of the frame-up was that it solved multiple problems simultaneously. King Philip got debt relief and seized control of Templar assets in France. The Vatican eliminated a rival power center and absorbed Templar properties in other territories. And both institutions could present themselves as defenders of faith rather than perpetrators of theft. But the cover-up created a new problem: what to do with the evidence of innocence. The Vatican couldn't destroy documents that might be needed for future legal proceedings, but they couldn't allow those documents to become public knowledge either. The solution was the same strategy they use today: preserve everything but control access to it completely. This explains why the Chinon parchment survived. Pope Clement V needed documentation of his private meeting with the Templar leaders in case questions arose about the legitimacy of the proceedings. The document proved that he had followed proper canonical procedures, even though it also proved that he knew the accusations were false. It was kept as legal protection for the papal office, not as historical record for posterity. The same logic explains the preservation of the Processus contra Templarios. These trial documents were kept because they provided legal justification for the Templars' destruction, even though careful reading reveals the systematic fraud that made that destruction possible. Their evidence of both the crime and the cover-up, preserved side by side in the same archive. The Vatican's modern nervousness about Templar documents becomes understandable when you realize what those documents could reveal about papal decision-making. They don't just show that one medieval pope made morally questionable choices under political pressure. They reveal institutional patterns of behavior that continue to this day: the willingness to sacrifice justice for political convenience, the tendency to preserve power through deception, and the systematic suppression of evidence that challenges official narratives. Consider what would happen if the Vatican released all Templar-related documents tomorrow, scholars would immediately begin comparing the official trial records with the private papal correspondence preserved in the Chinon parchment and similar materials. The systematic nature of the deception would become undeniable. More importantly, the institutional mechanisms that made such deception possible would be exposed in detail. Those mechanisms haven't disappeared. The same Vatican departments that manage access to historical archives also manage access to contemporary church documents. The same policies that keep medieval corruption hidden also protect modern institutional secrets. The same justifications used to suppress evidence of past wrongdoing are being used to limit transparency about current controversies. The Vatican's handling of modern scandals follows patterns established during the Templar persecution: initial denial, controlled investigation, limited disclosure, and long-term suppression of the most damaging evidence. The strategies that worked in 1307 are still being employed in 2024, refined by 7 centuries of practice, but fundamentally unchanged. This is why the Templar documents remain restricted. They're not just historical curiosities. They're instruction manuals for institutional deception, detailed records of how the Vatican manages information, controls narratives, and protects itself from accountability. They show the blueprints of a system that's still operational today. But the deeper threat posed by the Templar documents goes beyond exposure of institutional corruption. They challenge the fundamental narrative that the Catholic Church uses to justify its authority, the claim that papal power comes directly from God and is therefore beyond human judgment. If the Pope can knowingly participate in judicial murder for political convenience, then papal authority is human and fallible rather than divine and perfect. The Templars died believing in the righteousness of their cause and the justice of their God. They went to their deaths praying for forgiveness for sins they hadn't committed and declaring loyalty to a church that had betrayed them. Their faith and divine justice made them perfect victims. They trusted the system that destroyed them right up until the flames reached their feet. But their trust also made their persecution particularly damaging to church authority. When obviously innocent people suffer for their faith, it raises uncomfortable questions about divine providence, institutional justice, and the reliability of religious leadership. The Vatican has spent 7 centuries trying to manage those questions by controlling access to the evidence that would make them impossible to avoid. The modern Catholic Church's relationship with historical truth reveals the same institutional priorities that motivated the Templar persecution. Maintaining power takes precedence over pursuing justice. Protecting reputation matters more than acknowledging error, and controlling narratives is more important than confronting facts. The methods have evolved, but the fundamental commitment to institutional preservation above all else remains constant. This is what makes the hidden Templar documents so dangerous to the Vatican today. They're not just evidence of past crimes. They're proof that the institutional culture capable of those crimes not only survived, but thrived. They show that the same organization that murdered innocent knights to protect its political interests continues to suppress evidence of that murder to protect its current reputation. The Vatican doesn't fear what the Templar documents reveal about medieval corruption. They fear what those documents reveal about ongoing institutional behavior. Because once people understand how the Church manages historical truth, they might start questioning how it manages contemporary truth. And that's a conversation the Vatican is still not ready to have. The stakes couldn't be higher. The credibility of the entire Catholic Church rests on the assumption that its leadership, while human and fallible, is fundamentally committed to truth and justice. The Templar documents prove that commitment has always been conditional, subject to political convenience and institutional self-interest. That's not just a historical problem. That's an existential threat to the foundation of religious authority itself. And somewhere in those climate-controlled vaults beneath Vatican City, that threat continues to gather dust, waiting for someone with enough courage and access to bring it into the light. 700 years after Jacques de Molay burned at the stake, the Vatican continues to guard the secrets of the Knights Templar as if lives depended on it. Maybe they do, because the documents hidden in those archives don't just reveal the truth about medieval corruption. They expose patterns of institutional behavior that could reshape how the world understands religious authority, historical truth, and the price of challenging power. The scope of what remains hidden is staggering. Beyond the Chinon parchment and the trial documents we've discussed, Vatican archives contain thousands of pages of correspondence, financial records, diplomatic communications, and administrative documents related to the Templars that have never been examined by independent scholars. Some have been catalogued but remain restricted. Others haven't been catalogued at all, sitting in unmarked boxes in storage areas that don't appear on official maps. A former Vatican archivist, speaking on condition of anonymity, described seeing entire rooms filled with documents, marked only with Latin phrases like Templari Secretum, Templar's Secret, and Non Aperiere Sign Licentia, do not open without permission. These weren't individual documents, but collections spanning decades of Templar operations across Europe and the Middle East, materials that could provide unprecedented insight into medieval economics, international diplomacy, and the real relationship between religious and secular power. But the most closely guarded secrets may not be about the Templars themselves. They may be about what the Templars discovered during their 2 centuries of operation in the Holy Land. The Knights maintained extensive operations in Jerusalem, had access to sites considered sacred by multiple religions, and developed relationships with scholars, mystics, and merchants from across the known world. They were positioned to acquire knowledge, artifacts, and information that was unavailable to anyone else in medieval Europe. Trial documents contain scattered references to secret teachings and hidden knowledge that the Templars allegedly possessed. These references were dismissed as fabricated accusations designed to justify charges of heresy. But what if they weren't fabrications? What if the Templars really had discovered something in the Holy Land that challenged fundamental assumptions about religion, history, or human origins? Consider the testimony of Brother Jean de Chalon, recorded in the trial documents, but largely ignored by historians. Under interrogation, he described Templar rituals that involved studying ancient texts written in languages unknown to Rome, and learning about the true history of the Christ from sources that predated the Gospel accounts. His testimony was dismissed as the ravings of a tortured man, But what if he was describing real documents and real teachings that the Templars had discovered in Palestinian libraries and archaeological sites? The possibility that the Templars possessed historical materials that contradicted official church doctrine would explain the Vatican's continuing nervousness about opening their archives. It's one thing to admit that medieval popes made politically motivated decisions. It's another thing entirely to acknowledge that the Church may have suppressed evidence that challenges the fundamental narratives of Christian history. This fear becomes more understandable when you consider what we now know about the complexity of early Christian development. Modern archaeology and manuscript studies have revealed that the version of Christianity that became orthodox was just one of many competing interpretations that existed in the religion's early centuries. Documents like the Gnostic Gospels, discovered at Nag Hammadi in 1945, show that early Christians held diverse beliefs about Jesus, salvation, and the nature of divine authority. If the Templars had access to similar materials during their time in the Holy Land, they might have possessed documentary evidence that the version of Christianity promoted by the Vatican was historically contingent, rather than divinely ordained. Such evidence would have been devastating to church authority in the medieval period and would remain extremely dangerous to institutional credibility today. The Vatican's treatment of modern archaeological discoveries in the Holy Land reveals their ongoing nervousness about this possibility. When significant finds are made at sites with Templar connections, Vatican representatives often appear quickly to consult on the preservation and interpretation of the materials. Artifacts and documents that might shed light on alternative versions of early Christian history have a tendency to disappear into restricted collections or to be interpreted in ways that support orthodox doctrine rather than challenging it. The case of the Jerusalem excavations beneath the Temple Mount illustrates this pattern. Archaeological work in this area has repeatedly been restricted or halted due to political sensitivities, but Vatican involvement in these decisions suggests that the sensitivities may be as much religious as political. The Templars maintained their headquarters directly above these excavation sites for nearly 2 centuries. If they had access to underground areas that contained early Christian materials, those materials might still be there, waiting to be discovered by archaeologists who aren't controlled by religious institutions. But the Vatican's fears about Templar secrets extend beyond potential archaeological discoveries. They're also concerned about what those secrets reveal about the methods institutions used to control information and manipulate historical narratives. The Templars were destroyed not just because they posed a political threat, but because they possessed knowledge that challenged official stories about the past. The systematic suppression of evidence related to their persecution established precedents for information control that continue to operate today. The same techniques used to hide the truth about the Templars have been employed to manage other controversial historical events. Selective preservation of documents, restricted access to archives, control over translation and interpretation, and the systematic discrediting of scholars who discover inconvenient truths. The Templar case study provides a detailed blueprint for institutional deception that has been refined and applied repeatedly over the centuries. This is why the Vatican continues to treat Templar-related materials as if they were state secrets rather than historical documents. They're not just protecting the reputation of medieval popes. They're protecting the mechanisms of control that allow modern institutions to manage truth in ways that serve their interests rather than serving historical accuracy. The digital age has made this control more difficult but not impossible. The Vatican has adapted by creating new forms of information management that are more subtle but equally effective. Instead of simply hiding documents, they now control access to them through complex bureaucratic procedures. Instead of banning books, they influence publication and distribution channels. Instead of burning archives, they shape how those archives are interpreted and understood. But technology has also created new vulnerabilities in their information control systems. Documents that were once accessible only to a handful of approved scholars can now be digitized and shared instantly across global networks. Researchers can collaborate across institutional boundaries and compare findings in ways that were impossible in earlier eras. The Vatican's ability to manage historical narratives is eroding, and they know it. The response has been predictable. Increased emphasis on misinformation and conspiracy theories as threats to social stability. New initiatives to promote authoritative sources of historical information, and the establishment of digital monitoring systems designed to track and counter alternative narratives about church history. The tools have evolved, but their fundamental mission remains unchanged: protect institutional authority by controlling access to uncomfortable truths. What makes this particularly troubling is that the same institution that positions itself as a guardian of moral authority continues to suppress evidence of its own moral failures. The Vatican speaks eloquently about justice, truth, and human dignity while maintaining archives that contain evidence of judicial murder, systematic deception, and the deliberate suppression of historical evidence. The contradiction between stated values and actual behavior couldn't be more stark. The Knights Templar died believing that truth would eventually prevail, that divine justice would vindicate their innocence, and that their sacrifice would serve some larger purpose. 7 centuries later, their vindication remains locked in Vatican vaults. Their innocence continues to be questioned, and their deaths continue to serve the political interests of the institution that condemned them. But their story isn't over. Every time someone questions official narratives, demands access to hidden documents, or insists that historical truth matters more than institutional reputation, the Templars cause advances. Every scholar who persists despite professional pressure, every researcher who shares suppressed findings, and every reader who refuses to accept convenient lies continues their fight for justice. The Vatican's archives contain more than just documents. They contain the power to reshape how we understand the relationship between truth and authority, between individual conscience and institutional pressure, between historical accuracy and political convenience. The secrets of the Knights Templar are not just about the past. They're about the present and the future of human freedom. And somewhere in those 53 miles of shelving, climate-controlled and carefully guarded, the real story of the Knights Templar continues to wait for its moment in the light. Not because the documents will reveal ancient treasures or mystical secrets, but because they will reveal something far more valuable and far more dangerous: the truth about how power protects itself and what happens to those who threaten it. The Vatican can control access to documents, but they cannot control the human desire for truth. They can suppress individual scholars, but they cannot suppress the collective search for historical accuracy. They can hide evidence for centuries, but they cannot hide it forever. The Knights Templar may have lost their battle with medieval power, but their war for historical truth continues. And in that war, every person who demands transparency, questions authority, and insists on evidence over propaganda is fighting on their side. The final reckoning is not about punishing the Vatican for past crimes. It's about preventing future ones by ensuring that no institution, no matter how ancient or powerful, can suppress truth indefinitely. The Templars died for their faith in divine justice. Perhaps their real vindication will come not from divine intervention, but from human determination to ensure that truth, however inconvenient, eventually prevails. That may be the most dangerous secret the Vatican is hiding, that the power to reveal truth ultimately rests not with institutions, but with individuals who refuse to accept lies no matter how old, how official, or how carefully guarded those lies might be. The documents are still there, waiting. The question is not whether they will eventually be revealed. The question is who will have the courage to reveal them.